Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Annette Stanton, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the Department of Psychology here at UCLA. In this evening's conversation with two of our professors, we're going to learn about experiencing hardships and building resilience in youth. Following their conversation, they look forward to taking your questions, which you can submit through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time while they're talking and having conversation with each other, and note that the chat function is turned off. I'd first like to share a little bit about our department. As many of you know, we're a leading psychology department of psychological science and education in the nation and the world. We have foremost experts in psychology and neuroscience who make discoveries in behavioral neuroscience, cognitive, clinical, developmental health, quantitative, and social psychology. More than 4,000 undergraduates are enrolled in our 3 psychology majors. And I'm so excited that for the first time in 3 years, we'll be able to celebrate our graduates who number more than 1,000 at our in-person commencement in Pauley Pavilion this coming Saturday morning. Our highly competitive Ph.D. program with its 206 graduate students supports tomorrow's leaders in research, teaching, and public service. We'll be hooding our graduating PhDs this Saturday afternoon on the Kirchhoff Hall patio. I know that many of you have experienced commencement at UCLA in psychology, and I welcome you tonight. One of my favorite activities as chair of the department is highlighting the exciting research and education conducted by psychology faculty, undergraduate and graduate students, and postdoctoral scholars. Tonight's event marks the 7th in our Psychology Presents series, with a focus on the topic of risk and resilience, how stress and adversity shape youth. If you've joined us in our prior Psych Presents, you'll see that our format is a bit different this time. Our esteemed professors will talk with each other about their research and its implications, and then I'll join them to pose your questions. Tonight's Psychology Presents, I think, is particularly timely. From the pandemic to the tragic killings in Buffalo and Uvalde, our nation's youth, and those of us who love them, are going through experiences that can be difficult to bear. Personally, I take heart in knowing that my UCLA psychology colleagues and our students, through research and education, are illuminating the causes and consequences of today's central problems and contributing to their solutions. Taking part in tonight's conversations, I hope you can also take heart. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce 2 superb faculty members. Dr. Yana Yuen is professor of developmental psychology. She studies adolescent social emotional development by focusing on peer relationships such as peer rejection, bullying, and friendships. Dr. Yuen studies teens' relationships with their peers primarily in school contexts. She conceptualizes schools and classrooms as ecological niches shaped by student composition. She's particularly interested in the effects of school and classroom diversity on friendships and emotional well-being in youth. A central goal of her work is to understand what types of environments promote social inclusion. Dr. Yuen is author of Focus on the Wonder Years, Challenges Facing American Middle School, and has a long history of conducting research in Los Angeles area public schools with diverse students. She serves as an expert consultant to many organizations on the problem of bullying. Welcome, Professor Yuen. Now I want to introduce Dr. Jennifer Silvers. Dr. Jennifer Silvers is a newly promoted associate professor of developmental and social psychology. She directs the Social Affective Neuroscience and Developmental Laboratory, aka the SAND Lab, where she and her students use the tools of neuroscience to understand the effects of stress and social relationships on the emotional brain in children and adolescents. Her SAND lab members also seek to translate basic scientific findings to special populations who are at risk for emotion dysregulation. Among Dr. Silver's many honors are the Early Career Research Contributions Award from the Society for Research on Child Development in 2019 and the Boyd McCandless Award in 2021 from the Division of Developmental Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Within the Department of Psychology, Dr. Silvers holds the Bernice Wenzel and Wenzel Jeffrey Term Chair in Developmental Neuroscience. Welcome, Dr. Silvers. Okay, take it away, professors.
Thank you so much, Annette, Dr. Stanton, for these introductions. And again, as you heard, first of all, welcome everybody. So as you got a sense from those introductions, we have a particular perspective on this very large topic of risk and resilience tonight. So we both, Dr. Silvers, Jen, and I, we study social relationships, and our research shows so clearly how negative social experiences serve as important risk factors, easily compromising mental health and well-being of children and youth. And in turn, positive relationships can serve as really important protective factors, increasing the resiliency of youth. So as you heard, we are using a slightly different format this evening compared to the last few times. And I'm going to start by interviewing my dear colleague, Jennifer. So Jen, to understand social emotional health, risk and resiliency, you conduct this fascinating research on early adversity, how early experiences shape development. So in one set of studies, you specifically focus on how this early adversity affects brain and behavior. So can you tell us about some of your main findings on how early adversity affects the brain and why it matters? And maybe you want to start by defining adversity for us all?
That sounds like a great starting point, Yana. Yes, so I think that defining adversity is actually a big challenge for the field. Every child out there is going to experience stress at some point and experience something challenging. To me and to many of my colleagues, when stress shifts into being adversity or a really problematic kind of stress is when it exceeds a child's capacity to cope. And part of why it matters so much that we understand early life adversity or early life stress and these more profound types of stressors is because it's the single biggest preventable cause of mental illness in youth and in adults. It has lifelong consequences. So my lab is particularly interested in caregiving adversity. So this is when children experience things like abuse or neglect at the hands of caregivers, or if they're deprived of stable caregiving due to being in institutional orphanage care or foster care early in life. And for the last several years, one way in which we've really focused in on the effects of caregiving adversity on long-term developmental outcomes is by working with this really fantastic group of youth, currently adolescents, who were adopted as toddlers from institutional orphanage care. And as I mentioned, these folks are now adolescents. So we've been working with these youth and their families to really understand two things. One is what are on average the brain and behavioral consequences of experiencing this really profound form of early adversity, which is orphanage care. And then two, what explains the range of outcomes we see after adversity exposure, because it is a wide range, and that's something that I'll come back to a few times. So the first thing to kind of address the first point about what do we see on average after experiencing early adversity, at least in the form of institutional orphanage care, but really a lot of these effects generalize to other kinds of extreme adversity. We see that early adversity increase the risk of a lot of things, including the risk of elevated anxiety and mood symptoms in adolescence, It makes individuals more likely to process sensory stimuli differently. This is a new line of work that we've been pursuing that's really interesting, in part because that actually in turn increases the risk for mood and anxiety symptoms. It subtly impacts the way in which individuals weigh potential risks and rewards when making decisions. And it impacts several features of brain development, including brain regions that are important for emotional learning and emotion regulation. So those are the things on average that are affected by early adversity. But perhaps the single biggest thing we see is that our youth who were exposed to early adversity show a much wider range of outcomes than our youth who were not exposed to that profound adversity. It's a huge potential that we see for how someone might develop after experiencing early adversity. In other words, early adversity increases the probability of a child experiencing social and emotional challenges, but nothing is set in stone. And that's, I think, the piece of the puzzle that's actually really interesting to me in my lab right now, is understanding what are the mechanisms that might explain that range of outcomes.
Well, that's a perfect setup, because I was going to ask, so what are the mechanisms that can help account for this range of outcomes for these individuals who experience this early adversity? So what are the mechanisms for the positive and negative outcomes?
It's a good question. And one that, any student who's ever taken a class with me knows I can talk a lot about. So I'll try to restrain myself. I was talking through some potential topics with my 5-year-old today, and she started to get bored when I got to like point number 5. So I'll keep it to 4 mechanisms. So there's a few that we're really pursuing right now in my lab that I think are promising to understand the sort of heterogeneous outcomes we see after adversity. One is a biological mechanism. So we have been finding in some work that we're currently pursuing that youth who experience early adversity in the form of institutional orphanage care as toddlers are showing lasting differences in gene expression as adolescents that's relevant for immune functioning. This is one potential biological pathway that might explain how early adversity shapes the brain and body to have ongoing consequences for one's development. And so that's something that we're currently looking at. We're seeing that there are these lasting effects, and we're now trying to link those lasting effects to differences in brain and behavior. A second mechanism that we're seeing is a neural one. And this one's complicated because it has a positive and a negative twist to it in a sense. So we and others have found that early adversity can change the timing of development. And it doesn't change the timing in a universal way. It doesn't speed up brain development globally or slow it down. It seems to have regionally specific effects. So specifically, we've observed that experiencing early adversity seems to speed up development of brain circuits that are important for detecting and learning about potential threats in the environment. This seems like it could be a bad thing on its head. It sounds as though we're asking kids to grow up too fast. But from a sort of evolutionary perspective, this actually makes a ton of sense, that when you're growing up in an environment where you don't have an adult to take care of you, you need to be looking out for yourself. And this might be the brain's way of adapting to that set of circumstances and trying to reprioritize the developmental needs of an individual in accordance with the world they're growing up in. And interestingly, we've actually found that those individuals who show this more accelerated pattern of development tend to fare better than youth who experienced adversity who don't show that pattern, in terms of anxiety, at least in the short term. What we don't know is the long-term consequences, and we also don't know if there could be trade-offs with other aspects of functioning. And those are things that we're really interested in. Now, a third sort of mechanism that might explain variability in outcomes is a type of individual difference between youth. So I had mentioned before that on average, we see youth who experienced early adversity are at risk for emotional problems. And one area that we see as particularly are difficulties with emotion regulation. I'm sorry, one area we see this particularly is in the realm of anxiety and other sort of mood issues. So one thing we've been observing is that the link between early adversity and anxiety and mood outcomes can be largely attributed to differences in the kinds of emotion regulation strategies youth use. So those youth who experienced early adversity, who deal with emotional problems by suppressing them or by not sharing what they're feeling, are at much higher risk for mood and anxiety problems. So this suggests that this is actually a really valuable sort of point of intervention we could pursue. And indeed, we're looking into this now about developing a few different tools we can use to teach youth more adaptive strategies and to discourage them from using these strategies that put them at greater risk for emotional problems. The last thing I'll mention is the one that ties into the central theme for tonight, which is that, and it's not one related just to individuals, but to the relationships they have. So adversity exposed youth who, after experiencing adversity, develop strong, secure relationships with their adoptive parents, for example, or with other caregivers in their lives, tend to also show healthier brain and behavior development. And we think this really points to the broader importance of social relationships for development. And we're currently starting some work to not only continue looking at the role that parents play, but also that friends might play in fostering some of this resilience in youth exposed to adversity.
Thank you. So, I'd like to follow up on that emotion regulation that you mentioned as your third.
It matters.
Yes. So tell us, what exactly does that entail? And why is it so important? An important outcome or a developmental factor to study?
Sure. So emotion regulation is not one thing. That's, I think, the first thing to note. It's really a toolbox or a collection of skills that allow individuals to adaptively manage their emotions in accordance with their goals. I live with 2 preschool age children, so I'm seeing what it looks like before emotion regulation exists. And if you ever need a reminder for why it's important, you can just come to my house and hang out with them for a bit. But more broadly than just my lived experience, emotion regulation is important for us to achieve our goals, to form relationships, to do all the important stuff that gives our lives meaning. These are the kinds of skills that allow kids to keep from getting in fights with their friends. It's what allows them to stick with a difficult task at school after experiencing a setback, to have just 1 cookie instead of 2 and avoid a stomach ache, to overcome their fears and try something new, like trying out for a sports team or a school play. Beyond these sort of daily functioning sort of activities, emotion regulation is a cornerstone of mental health. And numerous forms of psychopathology, ranging from anxiety disorders to substance use disorders, are characterized, at least in part, by difficulties with emotion regulation. So that's one of the reasons it's important, is it's really critical for mental health. But from a developmental perspective, it's also important because emotion regulation skills get built during childhood and adolescence. And it's also during this period that we tend to see mental health problems first emerge. So it suggests that this period from childhood to adolescence, often the transition between them, is something of a make or break time for emotion regulation development.
That's fascinating. Now, how do these skills develop? And can we and who can affect how they develop? That is, for example, do parents play a role?
I like to imagine we do. And luckily, science is on my side here. So like most developmental skills, emotion regulation emerges in part because the brain develops in a way that allows them to emerge. The sort of raw machinery comes online that enables skills to develop, but also because a child's environment gives them opportunities to learn about emotion regulation and to practice emotion regulation skills. So this is where parents come into play. Parents play a huge role in making children feel safe. And that's the first step to developing emotion regulation skills. And also in modeling and coaching emotion regulation for their children and giving them opportunities to practice emotion regulation. So I mentioned modeling and coaching their children. With young children, this can be as simple as a parent mentioning, I'm feeling stressed, I'm gonna go for a run to try to blow off some steam. That's a way that you can model, like, I'm having feelings, here's how I'm dealing with it. It can be as simple as, my son is a total daredevil on his balance bike, and today he just bit it when he was riding his bike really fast around campus. It was me going up to him and asking, would you like a hug? Asking him giving him control over what would help him feel better and letting him know I'm there and available to him. Those are the little things parents do countless times a day, often without thinking about it, that builds emotion regulation. When children are very young, like my kids are, they don't yet possess all the neural machinery needed to regulate their own emotions in a mature way. So at this time, you can think of the parent as kind of their external prefrontal cortex that's helping them to regulate their emotion. Over time, parents can slowly remove the scaffolding, the training wheels, if you will. They take the training wheels off of the bike to allow a child to drive it more and more themselves and to regulate their own emotions while still remaining there and providing support as needed. In my lab, we've seen that children show particularly marked improvements in their ability to regulate their own emotions during the transition from childhood to adolescence, which corresponds strongly with development of the prefrontal cortex, a brain region that's important for decision-making, self-control, language, kind of all the things that we think of being associated with being humans. And also, really importantly, with connections between prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain, important for responding to and detecting emotions. Beyond parents and other adults, friends and siblings can play a huge role and can be a real asset for emotion regulation development. So we've been doing some work in my lab for the last couple of years now in young adults, showing that their college-aged folks are much more effective at regulating their emotions if they can have a friend help them by sort of allowing them to reinterpret or reconsider negative situations in their lives or upsetting situations. And right now, we're starting to translate that work to younger folks, to adolescents. And we're really excited about that, thinking about this as kind of a positive form of peer pressure that we might see, where adolescents might be particularly sensitive to their friends helping them out with regulating their emotions.
Now that you brought up adolescence, that's something that I'm particularly fascinated about. So, I'm curious about what's your feedback to our audience, to parents in particular out there who have adolescents. These transitions we know can be difficult, transitioning into adolescence and then out of adolescence. And I think that it's the into adolescence, we often, we know that it's associated with many new skills, but also a lot of challenges like risk-taking. So can you tell us a little bit about parental role during these transitions?
Yeah, I'd love to. I love adolescence. I know that they get a bum rap sometimes, but I think adolescence is really a time of opportunity. It's a time of challenge, but it's more than that, a time of opportunity. And in fact, there's some really interesting research suggesting that the extent to which parents have negative views about adolescence predicts negative outcomes in their children. So I guess that's one first piece of advice, is don't approach it with dread and trepidation. The first thing I would say, and I know this is annoying advice, trust me, I get it. I have a demanding job. I have 2 kids and a third on the way, but I'm just telling you what the science says, is to take care of yourself. Parents' emotional health is an important predictor of their children's emotional health. And that's true across childhood, but also in adolescence. Finding ways to talk about your own emotions, to regulate your own emotions, to model it for your kids, to allow them insight into your own successes and failures emotionally is really vital to them learning to trust you and to see you as a resource. You can keep it real. You can tell them when you're scared. You can tell them when you're stressed, but also just tell them how you're dealing with it and let them know that you're there for them through all of that. The second thing I would tell parents is that they still matter. They matter a lot more than they think, even when they don't feel like it's the case. So in my lab, we've been finding repeatedly now in a number of studies that older adolescents and young adults prioritize their parents over and over again on decision-making tasks, even when they report on questionnaires being closer to their friends than their parents. They prioritize their parents and they learn from their parents better than their friends. So you matter, and I'm happy to provide you with data to really support that belief if it's helpful. But yeah, there's really an abundance of evidence out there that parents matter all the way from early childhood to young adulthood and beyond. So just keep showing up and knowing that your support really matters. The final thing I would tell parents is that just to validate the fact that part of your job as a parent is not just to keep showing up and to know that you matter, but also to give your children space to make mistakes. It's really a fine art to allow your children space to make mistakes while letting them know that you have their back. But it's that art that's so vital. A fundamental task of adolescence is exploring the world. It's learning by trial and error, which involves making mistakes. And this is really a critical feature of becoming a functional, independent adult. So giving your children opportunities to explore while knowing that you love them is really critical. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean there's no consequences for making mistakes. There are consequences and those can be enforced, but just giving them the space to make those mistakes and knowing that you're still going to be there at the end is what matters.
That was wonderful. Wonderful reassurance to all us parents. And not only the parents of young kids, but also those of us who have a little bit older children. So thank you.
Still doing a good job, Yana.
Thanks, Jen. So now we're going to switch sides.
I'm going to turn the tables and start asking you a few questions as well. So I brought up a few places where my lab is just starting to really veer into looking at peer relationships. This is something you've been studying for a long time. You and your lab have done quite a bit of work to understand social emotional health and development in the context of peer relationships. Can you tell us a bit about how peer relationships can help us understand risk and resilience across development?
Yeah, happy to. So you just made an incredibly compelling case why caregivers, parents matter so much. But, you know, kids need to learn to form relationships outside of home and on their own. And that's why peers are so important. And peer relationships, friendships in particular, are really unique and very different from the kinds of relationships kids have with adults because they're much more equal. They have similar experiences. So it is through all of that that makes it easier for them to learn to take the perspective of the other, to feel empathy for somebody else. You know, mothers and fathers rarely get any empathy, right? Mm-hmm. So, but peers do. And they are also learning how to act on that empathy. That is to provide help, not only being the ones who always get supported or helped by others. And not surprisingly, kids who manage to have positive social experiences with their peers, who are accepted, who are able to form and moreover maintain good positive friendships with their peers, they are emotionally healthy. Moreover, they are very resilient when they face adversity or stressful experiences. So let's take an age normative stressor like transitioning to a new school environment. So those kids who have at least one good friend during that transition actually tend to do much better than those who don't have any. Similarly, if kids go through some non-normative stressors, you know, like let's say a kid gets bullied, it is that having that one pal that can relate to their plight that is very, very important. Having so really the friendships in particular, they are really very important sources of resiliency for kids. Now, having said that, we shouldn't take peer relationship for granted. I often hear this that, you know, yeah, of course, you know, kids are going to get along. What's the big deal? Sometimes they don't get along. What's the, you know, that is to be expected. They learn. Yeah, sure, they develop friendships, but, you know, they always don't. And what we know is that kids who don't get accepted, particularly those who are rejected or bullied, those who never are able to maintain those friendships that are so vital, they are at risk for emotional problems concurrently and later in life.
So you mentioned the importance of good peer relationships and friendships. And at the end, you started to talk a bit about bullying. And I think one of the things that often comes up for people is, why do kids bully? Like, why does this happen? It seems just so unnecessary, but you've done a lot of work to actually explain why this happens. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's actually a very challenging question. So we're not going to go and ask, so why on earth did you do this horrible thing to your peer? We're not going to get anywhere with that. So what we need to do is kind of think about not only studying those who engage in bullying behavior, their thoughts and behaviors, but moreover to understand whom they want to target, and how do other peers react to all of this. So what I'm going to try to do is a very quick summary to this very big fundamental question. And I'm making some inferences here. The story is yet to be developed further. But let me start with the definition of bullying. So unlike indiscriminate aggression, something that typically stems from frustration that we often see with toddlers and young kids, bullying is very strategic and targeted. It doesn't stem from lack of social skills. In fact, it often requires social skills. So it's not only physical aggression, but often involves exclusion, name calling. It takes place obviously in school settings, online, in schools, neighborhoods, camps. So this type of behavior is, as I said, targeted, and the way we define the sort of think about, again, how it's different from all other forms of aggression is that there's this inherent imbalance of power, and that these bullies really are capitalizing on this notion by targeting those who are more vulnerable. And what is very interesting is to look at these bystander reactions. That is, how do other kids react to situations when somebody gets bullied? And in one of the sort of daily report studies that we did, we know that on days when kids actually see somebody else getting bullied, they feel elevated levels of anxiety. We also know from other studies that they rarely intervene with bullying incidents. In fact, in most situations, right then and there, when bullying takes place, often kids just stand by. They may find it amusing when another kid gets ridiculed, unfortunately. They are smiling, some may even join in. And these kinds of behaviors really reinforce the bully and the bullying behavior. So what we have here is the bully capitalizing on who they want to dominate and control. And unfortunately, often, especially around middle school, in early adolescence, the peer group goes along. They align themselves with the powerful. And again, what our research in middle school shows that, interestingly enough, these bullies are often not liked, but considered cool. So what is bullying behavior in part about? It's about demonstration of power.
Wow. That it's really powerful to think about all the complexity underlying this behavior. And you mentioned that bullies tend to target those who are vulnerable. Can you say more about who is at risk for being bullied, why they're at risk, and what are the long-term risks, sort of risky outcomes that are associated with being bullied? Yeah,
so again, most of the time bullying is not random. So what we see is that the bullies want to it's really helpful to sort of try to think about these questions from the perspective of the bully, to try to be in the mindset of a bully. So when they target somebody, they want to be successful. They want to show the power, that their dominance. So they pick often kids who are on the social margins. This may be the friendless kid, the kid who is having lunch alone. And so those are the ones who get targeted often. Now, whether bullying continues, whether they continue to get bullied, that depends on how they react to the bullying. And what we know is one of the most maladaptive ways to respond to bullying is to submit, not try to defend. And if you think about it again from a perspective of the bully, that's probably very rewarding. That's exactly their goal. They want to feel powerful. And when there's somebody submitting to their ridicule, to their humiliation, to their aggression, that's exactly what they wanted. So in terms of the long-term risks, I have first good news. There are lots of kids who get bullied at some point. In fact, based on kids' self-reports, over 70% of kids say that they got bullied at some point. For most kids, this is sort of a very fleeting experience. It goes away. Is it random? We can't explain why it goes away now, probably not. So again, what we know is that kids who have good friends, who have sources of support, somebody who can relate to their plight, they often don't experience bullying for a long time. So they look perfectly resilient. So if a kid experienced, sort of not any incredibly traumatic form of bullying, more name calling, exclusion that didn't last long, they are probably fine later in life. But those who continue to get bullied, they continue to experience emotional problems. They probably initially were already a little on the anxious side, being, for example, friendless. So these emotional problems get worse over time. And one mechanism that we have specifically studied that helps us understand the anxiety and depression that is associated with getting bullied is self-blame. So think about it. If you continue to get bullied, you easily come to blame yourself and say, there must be something wrong with me. And if you think that that's something that you cannot change, you're likely to feel distressed. And it is these thoughts and feelings that then keep the vicious cycle going, because that is exactly when they are likely to get targeted again.
That's so interesting. And it reminds me a little bit of some of the literature on early adversity, on how children's understanding of it is so consequential to their outcomes. So it sounds like something similar here. How you make sense of the stress and the adversity really impacts your long-term development. So what can be done about bullying? This seems like a really challenging problem to tackle. What programs or interventions work? What does work? What doesn't work? What are some of the biggest challenges to preventing it and its harmful effects?
Yeah, well, I hope that from those are really good questions, and obviously critical questions for the field. Now, the way I describe bullying, I hope that it's clear now that, we can't just sort of target bullies,
right,
and think about that, we're going to fix the bullies so they wouldn't bully anymore, and that's that. We really need to be addressing all these complex social dynamics. And actually, many of the most promising programs out there are currently trying to address the social climate and really try to change the bystanders' behavior, give them tools and empower them to intervene with incidents of bullying. Say, hey, stop that, that's not okay. And it's amazing when kids do dare to do that, bullying stops. So, again, challenge to the bully is not welcome, right? So, these programs are wonderful. They are primary prevention programs. They target the entire school. The goal is to try to change the climate of the school so that it's more inclusive, supportive, again, what we do know is that they can be successful. They can decrease the number of incidents of bullying and the number of kids who get bullied. That's all good news. However, these programs are not easy to implement. Teachers need to get trained. They deliver the curriculum in school, and we have to find place in the school schedule to fit the curriculum in. Moreover, I personally have a little bit of an issue with this, how we assess the effectiveness of anti-bullying programs. So by focusing just on the number of incidents or number of kids who get bullied, we actually know that that's not necessarily an adequate metric. In fact, our research shows that victimized kids feel worse in schools with low levels of bullying or when the bullying rates decrease, because then they really stand out.
Yeah.
Then they are really likely to blame themselves. So, so what I think that we need to be doing is not being so fixated on incidents, or the numbers of, but rather think about how we build resiliency, how we can support those who get victimized. And
I could just keep listening to you two talk, and I'm going to do that. And we have such great questions posed by our audience. So let me start with those, and we'll get in as many as we possibly can. Let's start, Professor Juvonen, and from here on out, I'm going to call you Yana because it's shorter, with a question from our audience. Have the types of stressors changed significantly with access to social media? And if so, how have they changed? And are there any considerations we need to think about in terms of effects of those kinds of changes?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. Obviously, the online environment, there are lots of dangers and risks in it. However, all of those parents, especially if you had adolescents, that this medium of communication became essential during the pandemic and during lockdowns. So we need to be really very cognizant about what are the risks and what are, again, some of the really important goods or protective factors available through online. In my mind, everything, for example, that we know about these adverse experiences online that typically take place between kids and known kids who know one another, is that they amplify behaviors and negative experiences. So it's not that interactions completely change. They are similar to experiences and behaviors in the offline world, but they are just much, again, like bullying in particular, it really hurts the victim experiencing it online. So I think about it more as an application of social comparisons, being tuned to what everybody else does. It's readily available.
And would you guess that what you talked about in terms of bystanders intervening and say, hey, cut it out, would it work the same way on social media?
Well, this is one of those predictions where I was very, very wrong once upon a time. So when we started studying cyberbullying, actually one of my hypotheses was that, it's easier for kids actually to come to the aid of the victim online because they can sort of text separately and say, I just saw what happened, I feel for you, and extend support that way. Unfortunately, that's not happening. So again, I think that it depends in part on what kind of medium we're talking about, but social media in particular, every single comment gets scrutinized by everybody else. And adolescents in particular, they're very, very cognizant of their appearances. So they don't necessarily, again, want to side with somebody less powerful, somebody who gets targeted.
Thank you. And Jen, another question from our audience could relate to this one. And you've done your research primarily in that, young adult, young child through adolescence, and you're talking about building emotion regulation. Now let's talk about the transition from adolescence to adulthood. And so, are there ways that predict which people thrive in that transition and which people can falter or struggle?
Yeah, and this is a question near and dear to my heart. In addition to my day job, I'm a faculty in residence at UCLA, so I live in one of the dorms. Actually, that's where I'm coming from right now. I live alongside about 1,000 undergrads and serve as sort of an informal advisor for our students who are living in the residence halls. And so I see this in everyday life, that for many individuals, the transition to college and the transition from adolescence to young adulthood is an exciting, exhilarating time. And for many individuals, it's incredibly scary and stressful and challenging. And for most, it's a little bit of both. And so this has been something that my lab has started to look into quite a bit over the last 2 years. We launched one study where we followed 100 individuals in their first year of college to try to identify factors that might predict sort of thriving versus struggling. And we're now hoping, we have a couple of different grants under review to expand this to look at individuals transitioning from adolescence to adulthood, both in college and non-college settings. So far, what have we found? A couple of things. One, not surprisingly, again, that perceptions of feeling socially supported matter a tremendous amount. So individuals who feel supported by their parents, that allows them to maintain a relatively high state of emotional well-being. Friends matter as well, and friends matter more over time. So during this transition. We also see that individuals who report using effective emotion regulation strategies, so things like, and versus non-effective ones. So individuals who use those sort of maladaptive strategies I described earlier, like just holding their feelings in and not sharing them, tend to struggle a lot more during the transition. Whereas if you're more capable of doing things like looking at a negative event from multiple sort of perspectives, and including more positive ones, that's a really adaptive strategy that can allow you to respond to stress and adversity in more useful ways. We also have been doing some brain imaging work for a subset of participants who participated in that study. And we're finding some really interesting results looking at how people interpret ambiguous situations. So the transition from adolescence to adulthood is filled with uncertainties, and trying to figure out novel, social, academic, occupational, all kinds of different settings for the first time. And we've been finding that individuals whose brains represent ambiguous situations in ways that are more similar to threatening situations tend to have higher anxiety during this period. And so we're now following up on that to try to understand that a little bit better and to see if there might be ways that we can kind of build tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty as an important factor here. But I'll also just say that I think that studying the sort of structural factors of things like whether you're whether you're a transfer student versus beginning your first year at a four-year college makes a huge difference in terms of people's experience during this period, whether you're the first in your family to go to college, whether you're working and going to school at the same time. These are the things that I see also mattering hugely in my lived experience in the residence halls.
That leads me to another question that's been asked by the audience, which is, can you comment on how it's sort of a not one size fits all. It might be different if you're a transfer student versus a continuing student, et cetera. And I'm wondering, and through the audience, do your findings, how do they apply to people of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, and the range of cultural and ethnic backgrounds? So Yana, do you want to take that one first, because I know you really have worked a lot with diverse populations.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the question, because We talk about like individual needs, and we talk often about like what schools can do, parents can do, etc. But really, there's a lot in every single community that needs to be considered. And one thing that my colleague Sandra Graham and I have been really fascinated about is that what's the climate like? How supported do students feel in ethnically diverse settings? And what we find, maybe contrary to the common assumptions about their safety in numbers, is that there's actually safety in diversity. That is, often students, and now I'm talking about middle and high school age students, they they feel safer, they feel in these diverse settings, assuming that they really get exposure to different others. So it can be an incredible richness. And what we know in particular about close relationships then is that when students are able to connect with somebody who is ethnic and culturally different from them, from a different background, that's when we reduce prejudice. And so, this is the beauty of it, that diversity in and of itself can promote sense of safety. And these what we call cross-group relationships can be really instrumental in also improving intergroup attitudes. So maybe I'll turn to Jen for the rest of the answer in terms of sort of just maybe individual adaptability.
Sure. So I think I guess I have kind of two responses for determining like how sort of culturally generalizable some of these findings are. So one thing I'd say is that this is an area where, frankly, psychology has some catching up to do. So historically, we have often studied individuals who could and were interested in coming into a laboratory, which is a very small slice of society. And this is a place where I think there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of interest right now in expanding our scope. So I mentioned just a moment ago my own work of looking at the transition from adolescence to adulthood. This is part of why for the new studies that we're planning, our goal is to partner with Los Angeles Unified School District to recruit youth from across the Los Angeles area who are about to embark on a diverse range of paths at the conclusion of high school, in order to really identify what are the factors that sort of all individuals show as mattering during their transition to adulthood versus ones that might be more context specific. I'll also say that in the work that I described so far, one of the things we see is that social support really is a universal in terms of predicting positive outcomes, in part because it's a pretty subjective thing. Social support isn't the number of friends you have. It isn't the number of likes you have on social media. It's your own feeling about whether you are feeling connected and whether you feel like your social needs are being met. And when people can say yes to that, when they can feel that they have a sense of place in their broader social environment, it tends to be one of the most protective factors out there. Emotion regulation also always matters, but that is much more culturally specific in the sense that there are more norms that vary from culture to culture about what's considered socially acceptable as a way to regulate your emotions. And so while there are certain types of aspects of emotion regulation that do seem to be generally protected, I would say that's a little bit more variable for, across different cultural and ethnic groups.
And you're both talking about sort of the necessity of social relationships. And one of our audience members asked, what about somebody who really enjoys or seems to enjoy being by themselves? Is social connection absolutely necessary? Jen, you said it wasn't about the number, but is social connection necessary in adolescence?
Pardon if you hear in the background someone who is struggling with their emotions right now. That is my 3-year-old. But I think this is a great question. And solitude can be a wonderful thing. And that's something that, if it's something that is wanted. So one thing that's become very clear in psychological research is that there is a big difference between feeling lonely and between sort of objectively being socially isolated. And what really seems to matter the most is a person's subjective experience about whether what they are looking for, they're receiving in their social environment. I think that also having a degree of flexibility about what it means to be socially connected. So I noticed in the Q&A that one person mentioned about sort of neurodiverse groups might, individuals sometimes having somewhat different desires for what their social connections might look like. And that's something to be mindful of. But I think that people have variable needs in terms of what they want from their social connections, but most individuals want a degree of connectiveness. And so it's really just a matter of that being defined by the individuals. For youth, I think it does matter, partially because they're at this vital period of learning. And it's not only the feeling of being connected and sort of being supported by your peers that matters, it's also that having that input with peers and those exchanges are so critical for developing social skills, for developing the ability to imagine the minds of other people, to develop the ability to learn, to take alternative perspectives and so on. So it might be particularly critical during development when people are still building some of those skills. And that's something that I think we really saw born out of the pandemic, that that's something that's really critical in those earlier stages of development.
Yana, is an interesting question here. If once a bully, always a bully, and if you find that your own child is a bully, are there things that you should consider?
Those are great questions. Yeah. No. Once a bully, typically not bully again. So these, just like, getting targeted by bullying, similarly, those who engaging in bullying behaviors, it can be very temporary. This is where I think we need much more research. Anecdotal evidence suggests that kids engage in bullying behavior for two reasons. One is they want to emulate the friends, the peers, especially those high status peers, and they join in. But the second one is really anecdotal, and that has to do with that when kids go through phases where they feel like they lack control. I've heard clinicians talk about, for example, parental divorce or some other family tragedy, that then what happens is all of a sudden their kid, the teacher calls and says, your kid was bullying somebody, and that comes out of nowhere. So I think that every time that a kid engages in bullying behavior, you as a parent can ask, so what's going on? Why these particular behaviors are emerging out of nowhere? There's a very, very small proportion of kids for whom aggressive types of behaviors continue throughout their entire life.
I feel that we can just keep talking. But we can't, because it's time to go. So I want to thank you, Professor Juvonen and Professor Silvers. Your audience, you gave us great questions. I wish we could keep talking. We hope you enjoyed this session and have learned something that you'll take away with you. Everyone who's attending will send you a post-event email and with the link to the recording of this session, and please feel free to forward it to others. So we hope you'll be able to join us for our next Psychology Presents, which will happen in the fall. And have a good evening, have a good summer, and thank you again. Bye, everybody.
Bye.